The chamber stretched vast and circular like the inside of a massive dome that could hold 10,000 beings from across the galaxy. And Ambassador Chen Wei sat in the human section, with her hands folded on the smooth metal desk before her while the Galactic Council conducted another session that would likely ignore Earth's existence entirely. 70 years had passed since humanity achieved faster than light travel and discovered they were far from alone in the universe. 70 years since the Council granted them observer status with all the condescension of adults allowing a child to sit at the dinner table. And 70 years of careful silence while Earth's delegation watched and learned and documented everything. The Council chamber itself was a masterpiece of engineering that floated in orbit around Council Prime, a neutral world claimed by no single species, but governed by the collective assembly of hundreds of civilizations who had been traveling the stars for millennia before humans even discovered fire. And the sheer variety of alien forms present always struck Chun as both beautiful and humbling too. Her left sat the Melodian delegation, beings of pure energy contained in crystalline vessels that hummed with frequencies that made human teeth ache if one listened too long. And to her right were the Cthar representatives, massive creatures that resembled living gemstones with faceted surfaces that refracted light into dancing rainbows across the chamber. Floor, the current speaker, was High Commander Zarth of the Vrin hegemony, a reptilian species that stood 3 meters tall with scales that shifted from deep green to angry red depending on their emotional state. And right now Zarth's scales showed the confident green of someone who expected no opposition to his proposal. The outer planets of the Sol system represent significant mineral wealth that remains tragically underutilized. Zarth announced in the booming voice that all Vren seemed to possess naturally, while his forked tongue flicked out to taste the recycled air of the chamber. And the hegemony proposes mining rights to these worlds, as they are clearly wasted on a species too incompetent to properly extract their resources. Chun didn't move, and her expression remained perfectly neutral, though her aide, Marcus, shifted slightly beside her with barely contained anger that she could feel radiating from his tense shoulders. But she had trained her team well, and Marcus made no sound that would draw attention to the human delegation. The Cthar representative pulsed with soft blue light, which their translator converted to words that echoed through the chamber. We support this proposal as the primitive humans have demonstrated no capacity for efficient resource extraction in the 70 cycles since their admission to observer status. Ambassador Chun made a note on her datapad with precise movements that had become automatic over 7 decades of similar insults. And she had long ago stopped feeling the sting of such casual dismissals, though she never forgot a single one. The Council Primarch, an ancient being called Temperus, who existed partially out of sync with normal time and appeared as a shimmering humanoid form wrapped in temporal distortions that made looking at him for too long cause headaches, raised one translucent hand to call for a vote, all in favor of granting the Vrin hegemony mining rights to the outer Sol system. Temperus intoned in a voice that seemed to echo from both the past and future simultaneously. Lights appeared above hundreds of delegation seats throughout the chamber as species after species voted in favor of the proposal with all the casual disregard one might show when deciding who gets the leftovers after a feast. And Chun noted each vote with mechanical precision while her mind worked through calculations about what this would mean for Earth's long-term strategic position. The human delegation had no vote and no voice in council matters, relegated to the role of silent observers who were permitted to watch but never to participate. And this had been the arrangement since the council first encountered humanity's crude, faster-than-light vessels 70 years ago. Chun remembered the early days when her predecessor, Ambassador Rodriguez, had tried to argue for human interests and had been laughed out of the chamber by species who found the very idea of human equality to be amusing entertainment. And she remembered the day she decided that silence would serve humanity better than futile protests. The motion passes with overwhelming support, Temperus declared as the voting lights faded. And the hegemony may proceed with resource extraction operations beginning. Next solar cycle, Tsar's scales rippled with satisfied orange hues while he nodded to his fellow delegates. And Chun watched him accept congratulations from a dozen other species as though he had accomplished something difficult rather than simply claimed resources from those too weak to defend them. The session continued with other matters of council business, including trade disputes between the Crystalline Accord and the Hive Collective, territorial negotiations in the Outer Rim sectors, and a proposal to establish new hyperspace lanes through previously restricted zones. Ambassador Chun listened to it all with the same patient attention she brought to every session while her mind cataloged details about economic relationships between council members, military capabilities implied by territorial demands, and technological limitations revealed through infrastructure proposals. Marcus leaned close and whispered, "Ambassador, we should at least file a formal protest." Chun shook her head fractionally without taking her eyes from the proceedings, and her voice when she responded was barely audible even to Marcus, who sat inches away. "Protests accomplish nothing except to reveal our concerns, and I prefer they continue to underestimate us." The young aide settled back with obvious frustration while Chun returned to her careful observation. And she thought about the reports waiting for her back in the human quarters. Reports about fleet movements in distant sectors and breakthrough research in laboratories on Earth, and anomalies in council communication patterns that suggested internal tensions. 70 years of data had accumulated in human databases. 70 years of careful study while the council dismissed humanity as primitives barely worthy of notice. And 70 years of preparation for a day that Chun hoped would never come, but knew was probably inevitable. The Zan Collective representative rose on 6 chitinous legs to address the chamber, a being that resembled a massive insect with a carapace that gleamed like polished obsidian under the chamber's artificial lighting. And the Zine were masters of biotechnology who had seeded life on a dozen worlds and considered themselves the galaxy's premier genetic engineers. Collective wishes to present new classifications for pre-sentient species, the Zuan Hive speaker announced while mandibles clicked in what their species considered a friendly gesture. And we have updated our assessment of several observer races based on recent biological studies. Chun felt a cold certainty settle in her chest, because she knew what was coming. And Marcus tensed beside her as the holographic display materialized above the chamber floor, showing genetic comparisons between various species. The humans of Sol 3 show remarkable deficiencies in evolutionary development, the High Speaker continued with clinical detachment, as they possess no natural weapons, no protective armor or exoskeleton, no psionic capabilities, and cellular structures that degrade at an alarming rate, resulting in lifespans that barely exceed one standard century. Laughter rippled through sections of the chamber. Not malicious exactly, but the kind of amusement one might show at a clever pet's attempt to perform a complex task. And Chun weathered it with the same stone-faced composure she had cultivated over decades. We recommend the humans be reclassified as tool-using presentients who show promise but require several thousand more years of development before true sentience can be confirmed, the Xian concluded while returning to its seat with a satisfied rustle of wings. Ambassador Chun made another note on her datapad, and this time she allowed herself the smallest smile that no one else would notice. A smile that contained knowledge about human quantum computers that had already cracked genetic encryption, about human stealth ships that had mapped every gen world without detection, and about human patience that was vast but not infinite. The session ended 3 hours later, and the delegates filed out in their various forms, some walking on legs, others floating on anti-gravity fields, and a few existing as mobile energy patterns that drifted through the air like intelligent foggen gathered her materials with calm precision while Marcus and the other human aides waited. And together they left the chamber through corridors that had become familiar over 7 decades of silent observation. "One day they'll regret this," Marcus said quietly as they walked. Chun nodded once. "One day, but not yet. We still have work to do." Back in the human quarters, she began composing her daily report to Earth. A report that would be analyzed by committees and military strategists and scientists who were building something extraordinary in the silence between insults. And she thought about patience and preparation and the day when silence would no longer serve humanity's interests. That day was coming. Chun knew, and when it arrived, the galaxy would learn that humanity's greatest strength had never been claws or armor or psionic power, but the ability to endure and adapt and prepare while others mistook quietness for weakness. 3 months passed after the Zun Collective's classification proposal, and the insults against humanity had grown more frequent with each council session, as though the member species sensed some invisible deadline approaching that required them to establish humanity's inferior position beyond any doubt. Ambassador Chun continued her silent vigil in the council chamber, while Earth scientists worked in hidden laboratories and human fleets moved through deep space on trajectories that avoided all council monitoring stations. And the reports she received grew more encouraging with each passing week. The Kthar had requested a special session to present their comprehensive study of observer species. And Chun knew without reading the agenda what conclusion their crystalline minds had reached about humanity. The chamber filled with delegates who seemed more animated than usual, as though they anticipated entertainment rather than the dry recitation of scientific data. And Chun noticed several species had sent larger delegations than normal, including junior members who rarely attended routine sessions. Hi. Scholar Prism of the Kthar moved to the center speaking platform on legs that were actually concentrated beams of solidified light that allowed the massive crystalline being to walk, despite having no traditional limbs. And Prism's faceted surface caught the chamber's illumination and scattered it into patterns that some species found beautiful and others found disorienting. The Kthar Crystalline Academy has completed a 30-year study examining the biological, technological, and psionic capabilities of all observer species. Prism announced in tones that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. And our findings reveal significant disparities in evolutionary achievement. Holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber, showing comparative data between species. Charts measuring everything from cellular efficiency to technological innovation rates. And Chun studied each graph with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades analyzing such information. The human species presents a unique case. Prism continued while highlighting Earth's data in pulsing red light, as they demonstrate tool-using intelligence without any of the standard markers of true sentience. Marcus started to rise from his seat, but Chun placed a hand on his arm with pressure that communicated both restraint and patience. And the young aide settled back, though his jaw remained clenched tight enough that Chun could see muscles jumping beneath the skin. Humans possess no natural defenses beyond primitive immune responses. Prism elaborated while images of human biology appeared above the chamber. And they lack the armored hides of the Vrin, the energy-based forms of the Melodians, the crystalline resilience of the Kthar, or even the basic chitinous protection of the Zan. More laughter rippled through the chamber, and Chun noted which species found the presentation amusing versus which ones remained silent, cataloging alliances and potential sympathies for future reference. Furthermore, humans demonstrate zero psionic capability. Prism continued with the relentless logic that crystalline beings applied to all analysis. As they cannot communicate telepathically, manipulate matter with thought alone, or even perceive the basic psionic frequencies that 93% of council species consider fundamental to consciousness. The Melodian delegation pulsed with colors that their translator converted to supportive harmonics, and one of their energy beings drifted toward the speaking platform to add their own observations. The Melodian chorus concurs with the Cthar assessment. The beings sang in frequencies that human ears could barely detect, but the translation systems rendered as words. And we propose that humanity be granted client status under the guidance of more advanced species. Chun's expression remained neutral, though internally she considered the implications of client status, which would effectively make humanity subjects of another species with no right to independent action or development. And she thought about the human fleets currently positioned in 17 different star systems that the Council believed were empty. Client status would benefit the humans greatly, the Melodian continued, while swirling through the air in patterns that resembled artistic expression, as they could learn proper civilization under species who have mastered the arts of psionic communication, energy manipulation, and temporal perception. Ambassador. Chun made notes with the same mechanical precision she always displayed while her mind worked through scenarios about what humanity's response should be if the Council actually voted to impose client status. And she decided that such a vote would trigger protocols that had been prepared for exactly this contingency. The session continued for hours, with species after species offering their analysis of humanity's deficiencies. And Chun sat through all of it with the patience of someone who knew that every insult was being recorded and every dismissal would eventually be answered. 2 weeks later, emergency session was called when reports reached Council Prime about a plague spreading through the peripheral worlds, a region of space that contained both Council colonies and human settlements scattered across dozens of star systems. The Zahn Collective had already deployed their bioscience teams to the affected areas, and the Hive Speaker rose to present their findings with an urgency that suggested genuine concern rather than the usual bureaucratic posturing. The plague is a novel pathogen that attacks cellular structures across multiple species types, the Zahn announced, while holographic images showed the microscopic organism in terrifying detail. And it has already killed 3 million beings across 17 worlds. The chamber erupted in concerned chatter as delegates realized the scope of the threat, and several species demanded immediate action while others called for quarantine protocols that would isolate the peripheral worlds entirely. The collective has developed a cure, the Hive Speaker continued, and the chamber fell silent with hope, as our genetic engineers have created a tailored virus that neutralizes the pathogen and restores normal cellular function. Relief swept through the delegates like a physical wave, and several species began thanking the Zahn for their rapid response. But Chun noticed the Hive Speaker's mandibles clicking in a pattern that suggested the announcement was not yet complete. However, the Zenning Hive Speaker said while the chamber quieted again, "The cure is resource-intensive to produce, and we must prioritize its distribution to populations with the highest probability of survival and contribution to galactic civilization." Chun felt cold certainty settle in her stomach because she knew where this was leading. And beside her, Marcus had gone completely still with the kind of tension that preceded either violence or tears. The human colonies in the affected region show the lowest survival probability due to their biological weaknesses. The Zun continued with clinical detachment, and distributing the cure to human populations would waste resources that could save species with more robust physiology and longer life expectancy. The chamber remained silent, and Chun looked around at the assembled delegates to gauge their reactions. And she saw discomfort on some faces, calculation on others, and indifference on far too many. The collective recommends allowing natural selection to take its course with the human populations, the hive speaker concluded while returning to its seat, as this may teach them necessary humility about their place in the galactic order and encourage them to strengthen their biology through proper genetic engineering under council supervision. Ambassador Chun stood slowly, and the movement drew attention because humans never stood during council sessions, never spoke, never drew any attention to themselves beyond their silent presence in the observer section. Ambassador Chun, Temperus said with what might have been surprise in his time-echoed voice, "Do you wish to address the council?" Chun had practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times over the past 70 years, and she had always imagined it would come during some grand debate about humanity's place in the galaxy. But she realized now that this moment was perfect because it revealed everything about how the council truly viewed Earth and her people. "I request permission to speak," Chun said in a clear voice that carried through the vast chamber without any artificial amplification. Temperus tilted his temporally displaced head as though consulting with versions of himself in other time frames. And then he gestured with one shimmering hand that seemed to move through several moments simultaneously. "Permission granted," the Primarch said while settling back in his elevated seat. "As we are curious what the human observer has learned from 70 years of silence." Chun walked to the center platform with measured steps that betrayed none of the emotions churning through her chest. And she stood before the assembled might of galactic civilization with the knowledge that what happened next would change everything behind her. The human delegation sat motionless, and ahead of her stretched hundreds of alien species representing thousands of worlds. And Chun thought about the plague victims dying in the peripheral worlds and the message she had sent to Earth before requesting to speak. "Honored delegates," Chun began while her voice remained steady and calm. "Humanity thanks the Council for 70 years of observation status during which we have learned much about galactic civilization." She paused and looked around the chamber meeting as holographic displays materialized around Ambassador Chen with technology that made several delegates gasp because the image quality and data density exceeded anything the Council's own systems could produce. And the projections surrounded the chamber in a sphere of information that demanded attention from every angle. For 70 years, Chun began while the displays showed star charts marking human exploration routes that penetrated deep into territories the Council believed were secure. "Humanity has been studying you with the same intensity you devoted to dismissing us as primitives." High Commander Zarth of the Vrin hegemony rose from his seat with scales flashing angry red. "This is an outrage, and humans have no right to present data without Council approval." Temperus raised one hand, and his voice echoed with temporal authority. "The human requested permission to speak, and I granted it. So she will be heard." Chan nodded thanks to the Primarch and continued while the display shifted to show detailed schematics of Vrin warships that included specifications the hegemony considered classified military secrets. "We have mapped every Council species territory," Chun said while the projection showed star systems controlled by hundreds of different civilizations. "And we have analyzed your military capabilities, technological limitations, economic dependencies, and cultural vulnerabilities." The Kthar delegation pulsed with alarmed orange light, and High Scholar Prism's crystalline form vibrated with frequencies that suggested deep concern. How did primitive humans acquire such comprehensive intelligence? Chun smiled, and the display shifted to show human quantum computers that existed as probability clouds rather than physical hardware. Machines that processed information across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. You call this primitive because we lack psionic abilities. Chun explained while walking around the center platform with controlled energy. But humanity developed computational technology that transcends the need for telepathy. And our quantum systems can process more data in 1 second than your most advanced psionic networks handle in a year. Murmurs spread through the chamber like ripples on water. And several species who prided themselves on their technological advancement looked genuinely disturbed by the implications. The displays changed again, showing footage from Earth's history. Images of humans surviving in Ice Age conditions with nothing but animal furs and stone tools. And Chun let the images speak for themselves for several long moments. You called us weak because we have no natural weapons or armor, Chun said, while the projection showed humans crafting tools and building shelters and hunting animals many times their size. But we are the species that survived ice ages, supervolcano eruptions, asteroid impacts, and climate shifts that would have exterminated species with more specialized biology. The footage transitioned to show human history accelerating through millennia. Agriculture and cities rising, empires expanding and falling, technologies developing at ever-increasing rates. We have no claws, so we invented knives. Chun continued while the images showed human innovation across centuries. And we have no armor, so we forged steel. And we have no wings, so we built aircraft. And we have no telepathy, so we created global communication networks. Ambassador Chun paused and let the weight of human achievement settle over the chamber while delegates, who had spent 70 years mocking humanity, began to reconsider their assumptions. The display shifted to show the first human atomic weapon detonating over a test range. And the sheer destructive power made several species recoil, even though they possessed far more advanced weapons. You called us primitive, Chun said quietly while the mushroom cloud rose into Earth's atmosphere. But we are the species that unlocked the power of the atom using nothing but mathematics and determination. And we did this before we even left our home planet. More footage followed showing the space race. Rockets launching toward the moon. Astronauts taking humanity's first steps on another world. We reached our moon using computers with less processing power than your translation devices, Chun explained while pointing at the primitive equipment visible in the historical footage. And we did it through pure mathematical calculation and human courage. The Melodian delegation swirled with confused colors, and one of them sang a question that the translators rendered as words. If humans possess such capabilities, why did you remain silent for 70 years? Chun turned to face the energy being directly, and her expression softened slightly. Because we hoped that observation would lead to understanding. And we believed that patience would be rewarded with partnership rather than condescension. She activated another sequence, and the display showed human observation posts hidden throughout Council space. Stealth satellites that had been gathering intelligence for decades. And ships that moved through hyperspace using trajectories that Council sensors couldn't detect. We remained silent out of respect for this institution. Chun continued while her voice took on a harder edge. And we watched while you debated whether we were truly sentient. And we listened while you proposed making us client species. And we waited while you insulted our biology and our culture and our very right to exist as equals. The Zunhive speaker rose with mandibles clicking in agitation. Human ambassador, this presentation proves nothing except that your species excels at deception and espionage. Chun nodded slowly, and her smile returned with predatory intensity. You're correct that we excel at gathering intelligence. And we also excel at many other things you've dismissed as impossible. The display changed to show human medical technology. genetic treatments that repaired cellular damage at the molecular level, and life extension therapies that had already pushed human lifespans beyond 2 centuries. You called us short-lived and biologically inferior, Chun said while the Xian delegate watched with growing alarm. But human biotechnology has extended our lifespans and enhanced our immune systems and eliminated diseases that plagued us for millennia. And we did this without your guidance or permission. More projections materialized, showing human settlements on worlds throughout the galaxy. Colonies that had been established in systems the Council believed were uninhabited or too hostile for development. We have 53 colony worlds, Chun announced while the locations appeared on the galactic map. And we have mining operations in 72 systems. And we have established trade relationships with 47 independent species who chose to deal with us directly rather than through Council intermediaries. Temperus leaned forward with what might have been the first genuine interest Chun had seen from the ancient being. How did humanity establish such an extensive presence without Council awareness? Chun met the Primarch's temporally displaced gaze and responded with absolute confidence. Because you weren't looking. And you never thought to ask whether the primitives in the observer section might have capabilities you couldn't imagine. She triggered another display sequence, and this time the projection showed human warships. Vessels that combined technologies the Council considered incompatible. Ships that could bend space-time in ways that violated known physics. You assumed our silence meant weakness, Chen said while the warship schematics rotated in holographic detail. But humanity has been preparing for 70 years. And we've built a fleet capable of defending our interests and our allies. High Commander Zarth stood again with scales now showing confused patterns of green and red. This is impossible because humans lack the industrial capacity and technical knowledge to produce such vessels. Chun laughed, and the sound was not cruel but held genuine amusement. Commander, you made assumptions about our industrial capacity based on what you could observe. And you never considered that we might be operating facilities in regions you never bothered to explore. The projection showed massive orbital shipyards hidden in nebulae and asteroid fields. Construction facilities that have been building human vessels for decades while the Council remained oblivious. We learned to hide in plain sight, Chun explained while walking around the platform with measured steps. And we learned which regions of space you considered worthless or too dangerous. And we established our infrastructure in those places, while you argued about whether we qualified as sentient. She paused and let the silence stretch while hundreds of alien minds processed the implications of everything they had seen. And Chun could see realization dawning on the more intelligent delegates. For 70 years, you asked yourselves whether humanity deserved a voice in galactic affairs. Chun said softly while the displays faded to show Earth rotating peacefully in space. And the entire time we were asking ourselves a different question. Temperus tilted his head, and his voice carried curiosity when he asked, "What question did humanity ask?" Chun turned to face the assembled council, and her expression showed both sadness and determination. We asked ourselves whether we should remain part of a civilization that measured worth by natural weapons and psionic powers instead of by intelligence, creativity, and the courage to survive in a hostile universe. The chamber fell completely silent, and even the usual background hum of translation systems seemed muted, as though the technology itself held its breath waiting for what came next. The council chamber descended into chaos that would have been impressive if it wasn't so predictable. And Ambassador Chun sat calmly in her seat, while species argued about appropriate responses to humanity's revelation, with all the urgency of beings who suddenly realized they had severely miscalculated High Commander Zarth's. Scales blazed through a spectrum of angry colors as he pounded one massive fist on his delegation's desk. and his booming voice cut through the general noise with the kind of authority that came from commanding vast military forces. "This is nothing more than elaborate theater designed to intimidate the council," Zarth declared while his forked tongue flicked out to taste the chamber's agitated air. "And I propose we call the humans' bluff by demanding they withdraw from council space immediately or face military consequences." Several species voiced support for the Vryn position, and Chun noted which delegates nodded agreement versus which ones looked uncertain, cataloging potential allies and definite enemies for the reports that would go to Earth within the hour. The Kthar delegation pulsed with rapid light patterns that suggested intense internal debate. And High Scholar Prism eventually rose with crystalline surfaces reflecting the chamber's illumination in fragmented patterns. The Kthar Crystalline Academy requests verification of human claims, Prism announced in tones that sounded less certain than usual, as the presented data suggests capabilities that contradict established scientific understanding of technological development rates. Chen smiled slightly and activated her datapad with a gesture that seemed casual but triggered communication systems that reached across the galaxy to human assets positioned for exactly this moment. "Verification can be arranged," Chen said while her voice carried calm confidence. "And I believe practical demonstration will be more convincing than additional data presentations." Temperus raised both hands, and the gesture created ripples in local time that made several delegates experience momentary déjà vu. And his voice, when he spoke, seemed to echo from multiple moments simultaneously. "Ambassador Chen, the Council does not respond well to threats," the Premog said while his temporarily displaced form shimmered with what might have been concern. "And I caution you against actions that could be interpreted as hostile aggression." Chun stood and walked back to the center platform with measured steps that betrayed none of the tension she felt. And she thought about the thousands of people working on this operation across dozens of star systems who were waiting for her. Signal Premog Temperus. "Humanity has no desire for conflict," Chun responded while meeting the ancient being's impossible gaze. "But we also refuse to accept threats from those who mistake our preference for peace as inability to defend ourselves." She turned to face High Commander Zarth directly, and her expression hardened into something that made the massive reptilian take an involuntary step backward. "Commander, you demanded that humanity withdraw from Council space or face military consequences," Chun said while her voice took on an edge like tempered steel. "And I want to be very clear that such consequences would not unfold the way you imagine." Zarth's scales flashed through angry patterns, and his clawed hands flexed with barely contained aggression. "Human Ambassador, the Vryn hegemony commands fleets that have conquered 17 species, and your primitive vessels would be swept aside like debris before a solar wind." Chen nodded slowly and touched her datapad one more time, sending the final authorization code that would trigger operations humanity had spent 7 decades preparing. "Commander, your fleets are indeed impressive," Chen said, while holographic displays activated throughout the chamber showing real-time feeds from Vryn space. "I'm sure you take great pride in your impenetrable defense network around the hegemony's home system." The displays showed the Vryn home system with its massive orbital defense platforms, weapons satellites that could vaporize approaching vessels, and sensor networks that supposedly detected any vessel entering Vryn space light years before arrival. "Those defenses have protected your worlds for 3 centuries. Chung continued while the feed showed normal operations with Vryn military vessels conducting routine patrols. "And they've given your species confidence that no enemy could threaten your home." Zarth watched the displays with growing suspicion, and his scale shifted toward defensive blue. "What are you implying, human?" Chun didn't answer directly, but instead watched the countdown timer only she could see through her neural interface. And when it reached 0, the display showed something that made the entire council chamber fall silent. Every defense platform in the Vryn home system went dark simultaneously, and weapon satellites that had orbited those worlds for centuries simply stopped functioning, as though someone had flipped a switch that turned off the entire network. "Your defenses are impressive," Chun said quietly while Zar stared at the displays in horror. "But they rely on computer systems that we infiltrated approximately 68 days ago, using cyber warfare packages delivered by vessels you never detected." The displays changed to show human ships, materializing from stealth fields that bent electromagnetic radiation around their hulls in ways that made them effectively invisible to conventional sensors. Dozens of human vessels appeared throughout the Vrin home system, and they sat motionless in positions that would allow them to strike any target with devastating precision. "We could have done this at any time over the past 7 decades, Chun explained while watching Zarth's scale cycle through colors that suggested panic and rage fighting for dominance. "But humanity chose not to because we hoped for peace and partnership." She gestured, and the display showed the human vessels beginning to withdraw, while transmitting a simple message on all frequencies that repeated in every language. "We are here. We mean no harm. We simply wanted you to know." The Vrin defense network reactivated as the human ships departed, and Zarth collapsed into his seat with scales showing pale green that indicated shock. The Thar requested verification, Chun said while turning to face Prism's crystalline form. "And I trust this demonstration addresses your concerns about human capabilities." Prism pulsed with rapid light patterns that their translator struggled to render into coherent words. "This is impossible because humans lack the gravitational manipulation technology required for stealth fields of that sophistication." Chun smiled, and the display shifted to show human vessels in orbit around Thar crystalline worlds, ships that had been there undetected for months. "We also lack the ability to affect crystalline lattice structures," Chun said, while one human vessel demonstrated gravitational manipulation by gently lifting a small moon from its orbit, holding it suspended for several seconds, and then returning it precisely to its original path. The Thar delegation erupted in panicked light pulses, and several of their crystalline forms actually cracked slightly from stress, because their entire civilization depended on the stability of their lattice-based habitats. "We could shatter your worlds with gravitational resonance," Chun explained calmly while the moon settled back into stable orbit. "But again, humanity chose not to because we value life, and we hoped you would eventually see us as equals, rather than subjects for classification studies." The chamber remained in stunned silence as delegates processed the implications of what they were witnessing, and Chun could see fear beginning to replace condescension in many alien expressions. The Zun Hive speaker rose with mandibles clicking in patterns that suggested both anger and calculation. "Human ambassador, this display of force does not change the biological facts about your species' deficiencies." Chun had been waiting for this response, and her expression became something colder than the space between stars. "Hive speaker, you propose letting natural selection eliminate human populations in the peripheral worlds while denying them access to your cure." The displays changed again to show human biotechnology laboratories hidden on remote stations, facilities where scientists had been working on problems the Zan considered impossibly complex in the 72 hours since you made that proposal, Chun said, while the projections showed genetic sequences and molecular structures. "Human biotechnology teams have developed a counteragent that not only cures the current plague, but provides immunity to the entire category of bioweapons in the Zuan arsenal." The Hive speaker's mandibles froze mid-click, and the massive insectoid form went completely still. "That is not possible, because developing such treatments requires centuries of research and testing." Chun nodded toward her aide Marcus, who activated the final display sequence. And the projections showed human medical teams deploying throughout the peripheral worlds. "We developed it in 3 days using quantum biology simulations," Chun explained while footage showed human doctors treating both alien and human patients with equal care. And we're distributing the cure freely to all affected populations regardless of species. The displays showed grateful aliens receiving treatment from human medical personnel. And several council delegates who had colonies in the peripheral worlds leaned forward with new interest. The council chamber remained in chaos for 3 hours while delegates argued among themselves about appropriate responses to humanity's demonstration. And Ambassador Chun sat quietly in her seat, watching various factions form and dissolve as species recalculated their positions. Based on new information, some delegates demanded immediate military action against what they called humanity's unprovoked aggression, while others recognized that such action would be both futile and counterproductive, given what the humans had already demonstrated. And a growing third faction began advocating for full acceptance of humanity as equal members. Chun monitored communications from across the galaxy through her neural interface, and the reports flowing in from human assets confirmed that 47 species had already sent formal requests for direct diplomatic relations with Earth independent of Council mediation. Marcus leaned close and whispered, "Ambassador, we're receiving thousands of support messages from minor council members and independent worlds." Chun nodded slightly while keeping her attention on the chamber floor where Temperus was attempting to restore order with limited success. And she thought about the careful planning that had gone into this moment across 7 decades of silent preparation. The Primarch finally raised both hands and created temporal ripples that forced every delegate to experience the same moment simultaneously, effectively freezing the chaos long enough to regain control. "The council will come to order," Temperus announced in his time-echoed voice that seemed to resonate from both past and future. "And we will address the situation rationally rather than through emotional outbursts that serve no productive purpose." High Commander Zarth stood with scales showing complex patterns that suggested internal conflict between pride and pragmatism. And his voice when he spoke carried less certainty than usual. "Primarch, the Vryn hegemony acknowledges that humanity possesses unexpected capabilities," Zarth said while carefully avoiding looking at Chun. "But this does not excuse their deception and their violations of Council protocols regarding military development." Chun remained seated, but her voice carried clearly through the chamber when she responded. "Commander, observer species are subject to restrictions on voting and speaking rights. But we were never prohibited from developing defensive capabilities or conducting intelligence-gathering operations." She stood and walked to the platform again while continuing. "Humanity followed every rule that applied to observer status. And if the Council failed to ask what we were doing in systems you considered worthless, that represents your oversight rather than our deception." The Thar delegation pulsed with reluctant agreement, and High Scholar Prism's crystalline form reflected light in patterns that suggested acceptance of an uncomfortable truth. "The human ambassador is correct," Prism admitted while the words seemed to cause the crystalline being actual pain. "As observer status regulations contain no restrictions on military development or intelligence operations." Chun nodded thanks toward Prism and addressed the full Council with calm authority. "For 70 years, humanity remained silent and observed your civilization. And we learned much about your cultures, your technologies, and your values." She paused and let her gaze sweep across the assembled delegates before continuing. "We also learned about your blind spots, your assumptions, and your tendency to dismiss species that don't fit your preconceptions about what intelligence and capability look like." The Melodian delegation swirled with subdued colors and one energy. Bing sang a question in tones that carried genuine curiosity. "What does humanity want from this demonstration, Ambassador Chun?" Chun smiled, and the expression was neither cruel nor victorious, but rather showed tired determination. We want what we have always wanted, which is recognition as equals, full voting membership in the council, and the same rights and responsibilities granted to any other sovereign species. She activated displays that showed humanity's formal demands in clear terms that left no room for misinterpretation. Humanity requests full council membership with voting rights, Chen announced while the text appeared in hundreds of languages. And we request immediate cessation of all territorial claims on human space, including the Vrin proposal to mine Sol System's outer planets. High Commander Zar's scales flashed angry red, but he remained silent. And Chen continued listing humanity's requirements. We request equal access to Council technology exchanges, trade networks, and diplomatic resources, Chen said while more terms appeared. And we request formal recognition of our existing treaties with 47 species, who have chosen to establish direct relations with Earth. The Zun Hive speaker's mandibles clicked in agitation, and the insectoid delegate rose to address the chamber. These demands are excessive, and humanity overestimates its negotiating position. Chum turned to face the Zun directly, and her expression hardened. Hive speaker, humanity is not negotiating. We are stating the terms under which we will remain part of Council civilization. She gestured, and the displays showed the alternative scenario with human colonies withdrawing from Council space. Human technology being shared exclusively with non-Council allies, and a growing sphere of human influence that would rival the Council itself. Refuse our terms, Chen said quietly while the projections showed this potential future. And humanity will establish our own interstellar organization with species tired of being dismissed by the old powers. Marcus activated additional displays showing the communication requests flooding into human networks. And the sheer number made several delegates shift uncomfortably. We've already received formal inquiries from 47 Council member species and 112 independent civilizations, Chen explained while the numbers continued climbing in real time. And many of them have expressed frustration with Council bureaucracy and the dominance of species who view them as inferior. She let the implications settle before continuing. Humanity can offer these species partnership based on merit and mutual benefit rather than biological advantages. And we can provide access to technologies that some council members have restricted to maintain their own dominance. The chamber erupted in concerned chatter as delegates realized the full scope of what humanity was proposing. And several of the older species looked genuinely alarmed at the prospect of losing influence over minor members. Temperus leaned forward and is temporally displaced. Form seemed to flicker through several possible futures before settling back into the present moment. And when he spoke, his voice carried weight that silenced the chamber. Ambassador Chun, the Primarch said, while ancient eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires studied her with new appreciation. You have demonstrated that humanity possesses both capability and restraint, which is a rare combination in species who have been dismissed as primitives. He paused and seemed to consult with versions of himself, existing in other timeframes before continuing. You have also revealed that the Council's treatment of observer species has created resentment and potential fractures in our civilization. Chum nodded slowly and responded with respect for the ancient being's wisdom. Primarch, humanity does not wish to destroy the Council or create division among species who have built something remarkable over millennia. She gestured toward the assembled delegates, and her voice softened slightly. We simply want to be part of that achievement as equals, rather than as subjects or curiosities to be studied. Temperus stood, and his movement created ripples in local space-time that made the chamber's air shimmer like heat waves. The Primarch calls for an immediate vote on humanity's full membership in the Galactic Council. The announcement stunned many delegates who had expected days or weeks of debate. But Chem recognized the Primarch's wisdom in forcing an Immediate decision before factions could form and harden. Positions, all in favor of granting full council membership to humanity with all rights and privileges. Temperance announced while raising one shimmering handlights began appearing above delegation seats throughout the chamber. First slowly, and then in accelerating cascade as species made their calculations and cast their votes. Chun watched the voting pattern and noted which species supported humanity immediately versus which ones waited to see how the momentum developed. And she committed every vote to memory for future diplomatic reference. The Melodian delegation voted in favor with harmonious light patterns, and several minor species who had been dismissed by the old powers enthusiastically supported humanity's membership. The Thar hesitated, but eventually Prism's crystalline form pulsed with affirmative blue light, and Chun suspected the crystalline beings recognized that opposing humanity would gain them nothing while supporting Earth might provide access to gravitational technologies they desperately wanted. Hi. Commander Zoth sat motionless while his scales cycled through colors that suggested intense internal debate. And finally, he rose with obvious reluctance. The Vryn hegemony supports humanity's membership, Zoth announced while his scales showed resigned green. And we withdraw our claim to Sol System resources. Chun inclined her head respectfully toward the Vryn commander because she understood what the admission cost his pride. And she made a mental note to pursue diplomatic rapprochement with the hegemony once the immediate crisis passed.